the unfortunate thing is a lot of the people in positions of power tend to want to continue to exclude, and therefore marriage equality.
Marriage equality represents a fight to recognize the humanity of each individual and a fight to recognize the equality between any two people in India. Humanity is humanity, you know. People will find ways to love. You can't stop that.
I'm Leeza Mangaldas, and this is Love Matters, a podcast about relationship topics that matter to you and me. And today we're talking about how the law can influence how we love. While laws are intended to protect our rights, sometimes they may infringe upon our rights. And that is particularly true when you look at the history of the autonomy and agency and dignity of women and queer people. And who better to discuss this with than Saurabh Kirpal, senior advocate, author of the book Sex in the Supreme Court, and someone whose work has been instrumental to granting more rights to queer people. Particularly, his work was instrumental in the reading down of Section 377. He's also at the forefront of the conversation around marriage equality. We're going to be talking about all of that and more. Saurabh, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Leeza. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation.
I want to start by asking you about your Instagram bio, where you call yourself an accidental LGBT activist. Why do you say accidental?
Well, I considered myself to be a mainstream corporate lawyer. I never set out to do activism. I happen to be queer. So queer issues were obviously important to me. And I ended up doing matters which related to queer issues. But as I did more and more of those matters, it wasn't as much as I got sucked into queer activism as I pushed myself into it. I saw the injustices that were prevalent, not talked about, not just matters that happened in court, but even in other areas. You know, one goes to NGOs or so outside the court as well. The endemic injustice that the queer community faced in India made me more sensitive to it. It also, because I had the capacity to do something about it, because I'm a lawyer, I had the tools to do something. I felt compelled morally to intervene and start doing things. So, and I found it was kind of a self-reinforcing cycle. So the more work I did for the queer community, the more help was asked for. And it was a cause I believe in, so I did more. So I think it was a very positive self-enforcing cycle. And that's how one day I woke up and say, hey, I'm an accidental activist.
You're very humble. But, you know, it's almost exactly 5 years now since the reading down of 377 in 2018, September, right?
6th September.
And I'm sure you remember that day very clearly. But I want to ask you, looking back, both as somebody, you know, working in this field of law, and we're talking about marriage equality too, but also as an out and proud gay man, how do you think things have changed and what has yet to change?
You asked about what's changed and what hasn't. And I always like to see and be hopeful and talk about that which has changed. Let's focus on the positive, because the discrimination that happened in the past or is still happening, we know about it. I don't have to speak much about it. But what's changed really is, I think, the hope that young queer people have in this country. I travel across the country speaking at schools and colleges to young people, and they believe that tomorrow will be a better day. That they just fill me with optimism. And that really wasn't the case X number of years ago. So it has changed. There is a belief in a queer person that they are equal citizens, that they are full citizens of this country. And they are not afraid then to fight and ask for their rights, as they should.
I think that young people represent a very powerful force. And often, you know, mindsets are so hard to change. Change is rarely radical. It tends to be incremental. But with young people, because their ideas are still forming,
Yes.
they can adopt very quickly a new way of thinking. But I think the unfortunate thing is a lot of the people in positions of power, are often quite old people with quite regressive views that tend to want to continue to exclude, and therefore something like marriage equality, is kind of, we're plodding along, now we're equal, so why don't we have this right?
We wouldn't have filed the case if we didn't think that the Constitution required the recognition of such a right. There is also arc of history. There's also a movement of jurisprudence across the world in a particular way. So we were reasonably confident. We as lawyers, our professional competence or our professional etiquette requires us to argue the case and then trust the process. And if a judgment comes which is in our favor, of course we will rejoice. If a judgment comes against us, we will strive to change society and fight another day. You have no option but to accept a judgment as is. But that doesn't mean you just sit back and give up all hope. We have been there in the past. If you recollect, in 2013, the Indian Supreme Court had recriminalized homosexuality after the Delhi High Court had decriminalized it. So we didn't rest in 2013. A movement began, carried on by a host of people, not just lawyers who got the publicity like me, but a vast number of grassroots organizations and people tirelessly worked to bring about change in virtually every sphere that they worked in. And we saw the result of it in 2018. So precisely 5 years later, the law is overturned. But whatever it is, we will fight to improve society. There's so much to be done.
Totally. And I think that for people who might not have really thought that this is an issue that pertains to them, I think often the community that might not have thought about identity quite as much, the majority tends to be that way, kind of just, especially, you're cishet men. There's a sort of idea that, this is not really about me, like, a slight distancing almost, because it seems like a minority issue, something that man. But in fact, it does impact all our lives. And I love how you said that not only is the reading down of 377 a charter of freedom for the LGBTQ community, but a beacon of hope for us all. And as women particularly, I want to talk about marriage equality, because I think queering marriage actually stands to perhaps make it an institution that really needs to be reinvigorated with equality also for women. I mean, it is not an institution historically that has actually really thought much of women's rights either. Yet marriage is posited as this, be all and end all for the woman. You're like, who are you if you're not married? Right?
Correct.
And so I really think about how all of us have a stake in this, actually, and should see it that way. And even with 377, actually the law, colonial era law, was phrased, any carnal intercourse against the order of nature between men, women, animals. The phrasing was such that all, if you've participated in fellatio or cunnilingus, you're also a criminal, right?
Absolutely.
So I think we must remember that it pertains to us all.
Yes. Now, absolutely, Section 377 was not only about homosexuality. Of course, in its application it was, but the strict letter of the law did not restrict itself to homosexuality. And it was the missionaries talking about the missionary position, pretty much, right? That's all that was allowed. It was framed by Macaulay in a Christian conservative doctrine about certain ways of being. So yes, in terms of the law, it did affect everybody. But we talked about something interesting earlier about how queering marriage or marriage equality for the queer community will have an impact on women. But of course, because today marriage is a patriarchal institution, the rules and regulations about marriage, both in terms of the strict letter of the law as well as its application, are a product of patriarchy. Rules made by men, administered by men for the benefit of cishet men. And the moment you start challenging the underlying assumption of that doctrine and saying, well, why do you get the veto in terms of the queer community, the same question will then be asked by women, or indeed all the other excluded classes of people, because you're questioning not only the institution of marriage. marriage is but a reflection of the inherent patriarchy in our society.
Exactly.
So you are actually questioning the underlying root causes of the discrimination. And I think our equality code in our constitution, Article 14, 15, 16, 17, reach in and promise people that we will smash patriarchy. And that is why I think a marriage equality petition is tremendously important even for women. I think it has implications even for the Uniform Civil Code, which is being talked about. Sometimes it's talked about, then it gets out of fashion. Then suddenly it'll spurt up. I don't know how it is, probably seasonal. So it's all these issues are so closely interlinked, because at the end of the day, what is it that the fight of patriarchy represents? Fight against patriarchy. It represents a fight to recognize the humanity of each individual and a fight to recognize the equality between any two people in India. And that's a fundamental basic thing. And as long as you're fighting for those causes, there's bound to be a sense of fraternity, which brings everyone together along for this fight. So, which is why I say we queer people don't need to just fight by ourselves. We need allies. And I honestly believe that every person who even today is a homophobe can, through the process of education, reform, and discussion, be made to change their views. We don't live in a country which believes in revolutions, armed rebellions, or the like. We believe in discussion and dialogue and exchange of views, the way I hope this discussion will make happen. And I think while it's all right to go to court and ask for change and try to, as I said, smash patriarchy that way, I think another way that is happening is making people realize, as you said, is that we're in this together.
We're in this together.
Absolutely. And it has to change for the better for all of us. Extra right that I get promises and guarantees that a person who will need the same right 5, 10, 15 years down, their children, their uncles, their nephews, their brothers, their friends, all of them will get that right. We need to foster a belief that we live in a society that recognizes the values of rights. Right? We need to be a rights-oriented society. That doesn't mean you forget your responsibilities and duties. But I don't see how they're antithetical to each other. Right? Duties will come. But as long as we live in a society where it's okay to fight for your rights, and it's not okay for the state to discriminate against you, that will come to the aid of everybody. Just a small example, as you said, that even a cisgendered heterosexual man can be discriminated against in some way or the other, maybe at work, or maybe find his rights are violated by the police if you are wrongfully arrested, or you're stopped at a traffic signal and asked questions which you're not supposed to. Everyone has a bundle of rights which you all jealously guard and protect. So the moment you have a society where rights are respected for its least empowered individuals, the rights of even the empowered individuals will be looked after.
Absolutely. I also want us to just think a little bit about how we got here, and I want people watching to think about that too. There's still over 60 countries where being gay is illegal, and many of them are former British colonies.
Yes.
And how does our colonial history remain, such a sort of blot on some of our rights? And we I suppose it's been so long that we just see it as the natural way of things. We think it's Indian culture. I've heard this argument made that queerness is a Western import, when actually it's the shame and the stigma that was the Western import.
You're absolutely right about that. If you read the ancient religious texts, it's not as though there was this great abhorrence towards homosexuality. It might not have been celebrated and rejoiced maybe the way the Greeks did. But if you read the Kama Sutra, you'll have some very petty punishment if you do the act of homosexuality, which is illegal or you think it's bad. What you're supposed to do is take a bath and cleanse yourself. So the punishment is minuscule. So it's not seen as a very serious offense. That's even when it's seen as something wrong. And there are equally texts which do rejoice homosexuality. We have gods and goddesses. The idea of Mohini, the man who transforms into into a woman. The idea of the Ardhanareshwar, half man, half woman. Lord Ayappa himself in Sabrimala is the child of Shiva and Mohini. So, two male gods. So, the gender fluidity in our culture historically has existed always, and we talk about it in without shame. But what the British did was not only to undermine uh, this gender fluidity or alternative sexuality, but they, in fact, I think, uh, undid all sexuality. And the very idea of talking about sex became like a taboo subject. And it was not something that was encouraged at all. And that was the problem that what the British gave us. So this colonial legislation, which you said is right, not just in India, but till recently in Singapore, still there in Kenya, in a vast amount of African and Middle Eastern countries, all of which are former colonies. So the same principle of Macaulay's Section 377 exists on their books. And yes, it is a colonial diktat given to us by our white masters. But I don't think we should let ourselves off so easily and say that it was an imposition by the colonial masters. And we got free 75 years ago, right? We got our constitution in 1950. It's not as though we haven't amended our laws since then. Why is it that this section persisted all the way until 2018 when the Supreme Court had to come and strike it down? At a time when you would have thought it's a no-brainer. Even at that point, the government couldn't bring itself to amend the law by itself and say, all right, this is no longer a crime. They said in court at that point of time, I remember, that we leave it to the court to decide. Why? Why should a matter of protection of rights be only the job and function of the courts? Is it okay for the government not to recognize and foster our rights? No, absolutely not. It's meant to be a joint effort, right? I can go to court when the government violates my rights, but that doesn't give the government carte blanche to start violating my rights. In fact, it is their responsibility to ensure that my rights are recognized. So I actually say that it is not just the colonial imposition, but I think it was our adoption and internalization of the colonial mindset that has happened, which has persisted for the 75 years. Indian culture is all well and good, but our Indian mindset is not the mindset of a Kama Sutra today. That's not how the average man or woman on the street thinks. They are not followers of Vatsayan. They are, in fact, they have adopted and internalized Macaulay. And that is the problem with our country today, that we've shed our glorious, beautiful past and adopted a peculiar version of what we consider our ancient morality to be, which has nothing to do with what it actually is. But it's become now the norm to say, and I blame television serials on this. This projection of godliness being asexual, being a woman in a particular form, so removed from our ancient history and so removed from our religious cultural texts. But that is seen as a person who maybe does not know any better, as maybe the religious dogma. They think that that is the truth because that is what is being fed to us. And also, I suppose one of the reasons for that is we do not have a canonical text. The way there are the people of the book, the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, where you can turn to a text and say, well, this text says this, and therefore this is not immoral or this is immoral. Hindu philosophy, and I'm talking of Hindu philosophy as 80% of the country is, not forgetting that, of course, there are minorities in our country as well. But speaking of Hindu philosophy, our texts are always more accommodating, partly because they're very often, like the judgments of the courts, contradictory. Because they deal with humanity and even our gods have human sides to them, human failings. They're softer creatures than the all-powerful God telling you what to do, what not to do. So I think it's time we go back and maybe read our scriptures and reflect on what we were and ponder about why we become what we become.
And yet, I mean, all great texts, religious texts also have their issues, and we should be able to point that out. And the idea that religious texts are beyond censure, which is another idea that seems to be increasingly rabid globally, is another really problematic thing. For example, America repealing the right to abortion on these such grounds, and even in our own texts, there's misogyny, there's the caste system. There's a lot of things that we should also discard. So I think being critical, right? Being critical, it's so unfortunate that being critical becomes being anti-national. I think it is such an act of nationalism to introspect on your own culture and history because you love this country. Why else would you do it? If you didn't care, why would you criticize or hope for something better? Anyway, I want to move on also to the topic of marital rape, since we were talking about marriage and how it hasn't always been the greatest for women. I think, to put it mildly, I think that agency, the idea of agency, sexual agency, is a very, for me as a non-law person, when I look at certain laws, whether it's age of consent laws, whether it's marital rape, it's very peculiar to me because it feels like I never really have agency. As a teenager, I can't have consensual sex with someone who I might be in love with, and as a wife, I can't refuse sex. So, what is going on here? Why does my agency have so little legal standing?
Well, the answer is patriarchy. The idea is we had the laws of adultery again till recently, till 2018. There was a law which criminalized adultery, where the husband of a woman who had committed adultery could sue the man who she had had sex with, because the underlying idea was, but the woman couldn't sue the husband for adultery done by him. The idea is that the woman is a property of the man, and another man has come and taken over my property, i.e. my wife. This chattelization of women is the ultimate objectification of women, and one consequence of the objectification of women is to see them as property and therefore deny them their rights. It's a way to control women. Female genital mutilation is one way to control sexuality. Denying consent or denying them permission to refuse to have sex is another way to deny agency. So it's all part of the same problem that we talked of earlier. It's patriarchal institution.
And yet, it's 2023.
And we still have a marital rape
opposition to criminalizing that. It's so bizarre to me that men will protest the idea that marital rape will no longer be permissible. That there'll be boycott marriage trending on Twitter. I'm if you want to boycott marriage because you'll be allowed to rape your wife, please who wants to marry you? You might as well walk around with the rapist tattooed on your forehead.
Yeah, absolutely right. But I think you expect too much maybe from a community that has had rights for too long. I think they're so used to being mama's boys and getting exactly what they want, that for them to say that, no, you can't have this right anymore, it's not going to be easy, right? That doesn't mean that every cishet man thinks like that.
Of course.
I'm sure the vast majority doesn't agree with the marital rape exception, right? If you just explain it to them in how it won't be abused. One big thing is, this is a provision that will be abused automatically. 498A, dowry is abused. Well, every provision of the law can be abused. That does not mean you allow an illegal act to happen without any recourse. A woman who has genuinely been mutilated and raped by her husband can't be denied her rights on the ground that, some other woman may some point misuse this law, right? That to me is a perverse way of thinking, but it is a way of thinking. So we have to deal with that and tell people that, show them with statistics that their fear is unfounded. That this is actually just a narrative built around in the media that these laws are violated, when in fact they're not really violated. Most research shows they're not violated. And even if it is, you cannot permit a woman who has a right over her bodily autonomy, which has been infringed in the most brutal form possible by a person who is closest to her. Imagine just what is happening in this woman's mind. She is married to a man, and in Indian society, in Hindu society, her husband is everything to her. I don't agree with this, but that is how Indian marriages are. And that man in whom you have the maximum trust proceeds to rape you. And then you can't say anything about it at all because...
it's unacceptable.
And
I think what's really unfortunate is that when a member of the group with power does something wrong, it's seen as the exception. One bad man, okay? when the group without power, one person does misuses, whatever, false allegation,
Absolutely.
whatever, it becomes, oh, all women are liars.
Yes.
You know? And this is, even with Me Too or sexual assault, the fact is, it is underreported. Okay, so if 3.5 people make a false allegation, the reality is many sexual assault is a majority experience for women, and most people do not report it because it is too traumatic a process, and I'm not even sure they'll get any justice. It's just reliving the
Same
trauma.
thing like
You know, and
dowry.
so all of these. So it's so unfortunate that on the grounds of these people who anyway have very few rights are going to now misuse this right. Even if that happens, it's highly unlikely that will be the majority of how
It doesn't happen.
Exactly. And the reality is that, like, as a woman, and I can't believe I've had to say this so many times recently, it just blows my mind, this statistic. Were you to die by murder, the most likely person to kill you is your current or former partner, right? Husband. So, I mean, the statistics around domestic abuse, around that type of thing is unacceptable. The fact that we still are debating whether marital rape, I feel, should be allowed or not is, for me, a bit disenchanting with regard to the citizenry. You know, like, come on,
Wake up. There are many little gems like this actually that exist in our statute book, but all of them underlie the same problem.
Exactly.
A group with power, drunk on power, used to their own power, refusing to accept the fact that they have the power. You know, there's a whole men's right movement, and you can, there are these groups you can see, and they discuss their cases about, look, this judgment happened. There is a complete belief that they are the victim, and you just have to walk and see around yourself and ask yourself, which world are these people living in?
Exactly.
As I give you an example of dowry earlier, in terms of the fear of 498A and the abuse of the anti-dowry laws. If the system is so abused, how is it that dowry is still endemic? It's just constant. I mean, are we saying we live in a country without dowry? Can any man honestly put their hand on their heart and say that? So if there was a law that was getting abused, you would thought that the perpetrators potentially would stop doing this, right? Obviously, it's not getting misused. Obviously, it's not even getting used.
Exactly.
As you said about POSH, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act. The idea is that this woman is this harridan who will come and ruin all lives of these honest men, whereas there is constant, unsupervised harassment of women at every level, not only in the organized sector, but particularly within homes, in the non-organized sector. And women have no recourse, because where will a woman who is earning daily wages go to have her grievances redressed? And you're saying, let's take this right away from her in terms of POSH or ABC, the measly rights that the woman has, which aim only try to somewhat mitigate the disadvantage that she has. Let's take those away because it may be misused. Well, what about the abuse of authority that men do every day without any law stopping that?
Exactly. I want to also talk to you about what is perhaps a more, a law globally that has a less unanimous answer, even among the left. And that's age of consent laws. What's so interesting is that some of the most developed countries in the world actually have quite a young age of consent, like Scandinavian countries, Western European countries have, 14, 15. Right. It's often 14, 15, not even 16. I think it's 16 in the US. It was 16 here, we made it 18. So in the developing world, there's this sort of perspective that increasing the age of consent, at one point it was 12, child marriage was a thing, right? Yes. Is something that allows for women and children to benefit, right? Increasing the age of consent is progressive.
Yes.
On the other hand, some of these super developed countries with the greatest human rights records or whatever have actually quite a young age of consent, right? So how, and it's something that lawmakers globally seem not to have a single answer to. And I'm not sure, because I feel like maybe there have to be a bunch of different laws where consensual sex between teenagers similar in age should be acknowledged. That is going to happen. They deserve to be able to buy condoms. They deserve to be able to get an abortion if they need to. So why criminalize that? You're only making it more difficult for them to navigate their health. and perhaps in order to protect minors from abuse, there should be maybe different laws for adults in relationships with minors, even if consensual. I understand that any sex under 18 in India is considered rape, but isn't it a bit? I mean, with regard to consensual sex between teenagers similar in age, that's something we're just too squeamish about, right? And it's very gendered. Also, the idea is that the man is always the perpetrator, the woman is the victim. I mean, I could be a queer teenager. I could be, it's the gendering of it, the age. I feel like it needs some examination. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think part of the problem is the idea that you can have sex only within marriage. So the ages of consent for marriage have been confused with the age of consent for sex. So a lot of the movement that is happening about increasing the age of consent has to do with when a woman can have children in the institution of marriage. And therefore make it 18 or make it 21. But we must remember that's about marriage. And you can have sex without marriage, surprise.
Surprise.
Yeah, it's 2023, as you said. Maybe someone's watching this in 2024. And this will be a timeless interview. So, maybe in 30 years. So this was recorded in 2023. But sex is not necessarily only within the bounds of marriage. And therefore, having an age of consent which is so high, which is artificially high, creates a whole pool of criminals, right? We are all, as Vikram said in 377, unconvicted felons. It's ridiculous to imagine that people ages of 16 and 17 aren't having sex with other people who are also maybe ages 16 and 17. You're basically telling them that you're rapists. The law has condemned you and made you into a rapist. Now, what does that say about law, society, and its efficacy, right? When you are brutally condemning so many citizens into a sense of criminality of their own. So, I think these artificially high ages for consent for sex, not marriage, is absolutely erroneous. They must be much lower to match what life actually is. It's not a novel proposition, and this happens in jurisdictions across the world. What are called Romeo and Juliet clauses is that it is the law should be, and that really is something the legislature should look in. We have something called the POCSO, which is the Prevention of Child Sexual Offences Act. Supposing you have a 19-year-old man and a 18-year-old or 17-year-old girl, or how about even 18-year-old and 1-day-old man and 17 and 364 days woman. If they have sex, it's a crime. Yeah? And as you said, the assumption is that's the man who's the perpetrator. What we need is a Romeo and Juliet clause that as long as they are within X number of years of each other, then that is not rape.
And it's consensual.
Then it's not rape. And that's, I see, as lawyers, we see these problems coming to court all the time. And that's one of the marital rape exemptions. Helps, it has its uses. So what often happens in couples where the woman is under 18 and the man is over 18, and there's an allegation of rape by the family of the woman who's trying to stop this marriage because it's a love marriage, they will come and say this is a statutory rape and get the man arrested. So the family of the woman. At that point, very typically, if they're still in love, the man and woman marry. And once they marry, they say, well, they can't be raped because we're married, there is a marital rape exception. So
it's so complicated, right?
Perversity of the law, abuse of the law, but humanity is humanity, People will find ways to love. You can't stop that. And to the extent that the law impinges on it, you'll find ways around it. You're not going to stop something as basic as the act of love and the act of loving.
Let's talk about obscenity laws as well. I think that the idea of obscenity is so subjective, right? What might be obscene to you might be perfectly fine to me, and vice versa. Another colonial era law, and another one that's often used in the name of protecting women and children. Ranveer Singh's bum, for example, I was very happy to see. I don't know why they think we need to be protected. Women need to be protected from that
or indeed
imagery.
Men.
Or men. But I mean, it was some kind of women's rights thing of like, oh, this is offensive to women, right? The legal ruckus that was raised around that. but this idea of like sexuality as obscene, this idea that basically women could never want sex. Women don't want sex, right? So women must be protected from sex till they're with their husband, and then they can't refuse sex.
Absolutely.
Because they don't actually want it.
Right.
But now,
too late.
Yeah. It's absurd, right? So even, Urfi Javed or Poonam Pandey or any sexually confident woman who is publicly demonstrating a comfort in her sexuality is typically on the receiving end of, at the very least, moral panic, and at the most, some obscenity case.
Yes.
And I don't know, it's another thing which I wonder how we can re-look at, because firstly, what is obscene is so subjective. The phrasing is also extremely strange, right? Something that appeals to lascivious and prurient interests, to deprave and corrupt.
Yes.
I often worry, like, will I ever be, I'm going to call you, okay, if anyone
tendency to deprave and corrupt.
Yeah. The tendency to deprave and corrupt. Now, what is that, right? It's such a subjective...
As it is a very famous line of judgment that I'll know it when I see it, right? So there is, of course, a great amount of subjectivity in our obscenity laws, and I think they're rather archaic. And it is another attempt at patriarchy and protecting the body of the woman, right? For instance, why is it okay to be a topless man but not a topless woman, right? And most of us will just say, well, it's obviously you can't, that's obscene, right? If you show a woman's naked torso, but a man can have a naked torso, no problem, yeah? So I think that is an instance of patriarchy, that we automatically categorized one particular natural way of being of a woman to be obscene, and thereby forcing a woman to don extra clothes, and thereby controlling her body and how much of it she can expose.
Coding it in shame, right?
Yes, coding it in shame. So it is just a form of patriarchy. Again, our obscenity laws. Instead, what is required is for our obscenity laws to actually protect women against exploitation. You need laws where if there is any evidence of absence of consent, or it demeans the idea of what it is to be a woman in the eyes of a man, right? In terms of stereotyping or a particular form of demeaning portrayal of women. That should be obscene. And not obscene only on the ground of the fact that you're showing a body part of a woman, but how you convey the image of the woman. If you wanted to protect a woman, I think some of the serials that we show on Indian cinema are obscene, frankly, where a woman is shown as this hapless, woman who has just no sense or no choice and no intelligence. But that is demeaning to a woman, more than a strong, confident woman wearing something very low cut and strutting about, confident in her sexuality. But it comes back to patriarchy, because it's okay for a man to cover up that woman and keep her inside.
We saw that even Ranveer can't show his body, though. So it's a funny one.
That's again exception.
So basically, all bodies are obscene if naked.
Yes.
That sex is obscene. Bodies are obscene. The idea that there's something dirty and degrading inherently, it doesn't even matter. We're not putting a specific lens to whether this is how someone wanted to be portrayed or not. We don't differentiate sufficiently between, let's say, revenge porn and like an image I want to publish of myself to whoever is consenting to look at it on my platform, right? And therefore, I wonder how, and because it's so subjective, how we can, I'm not sure what the recourse is. Even these platforms, for example, will have rather female nipples are banned, and it's all in the guise of wanting to protect women. But I think as a society, if we were able to remove that shame, like why wouldn't it be great if one day pictures of a woman's torso could not be used to shame her? Just like and therefore, who cares if my pictures of my torso?
And that's by an act of normalization,
exactly.
Right? An act of acceptance and fact of the realization of the fact that sex exists.
And
people have sex.
Just the body.
Yes. But we just caught up again, colonial era mindset.
Absolutely.
Today.
There was a time when the sari was worn without a blouse.
Completely. The idea of the unstitched garment, we have had that in our culture always. But these obscenity laws, you're right, are trying to shame us and trying to thereby control us. But to your point about sex and obscenity, there is a clear link. If you write a book about describing the sexual act, it will be declared to be obscene because, of course, we don't have sex. We're a country of 1.6 3 billion people. I don't know how that happened, but we don't have sex.
Exactly. So anyway, I think we should introspect a little on all
Yes.
those counts. Okay, my last question as we wrap up. I know that you like to be optimistic, and so do I, but slightly philosophical question. Do you think that progress is linear, like every year things will get better, or do you think, I'm starting to begin to believe that maybe there's just a regression to the mean, we were progressive, then colonial laws, now, or like abortion is repealed. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder whether we actually do get better and more equal and have more access to equality, dignity, fraternity, all these wonderful values globally, or whether in fact it's like a seesaw, we take 5 steps forward and then 10 steps back.
Well, it is a seesaw. But I wouldn't say we take 5 steps forward and 10 back. I'd say we take 10 forward and 5 back. So I often talk about Martin Luther King and other people who said that the arc of history always bends towards justice. Yes, we will have advances in our rights to be followed maybe very rapidly by those rights being taken away from us, which makes it all the more bitter. A right that you had is taken away. Abortion in the US being one example, right against homosexuality in 2013 in India being an example. You thought you had a right, it was taken away. But I believe we're getting a more progressive society. Things are not linear. That's why I use the term arc. It gets better till it doesn't. Then it becomes a bit bad, but then it becomes better again. But the general movement is, I think, increasingly towards greater freedoms. And that is the principles on which our constitution was framed. And I think that is the life people want to lead. And history has shown us from 1950 till 2023, right? If it were a linear, straight, or even degrading, while it is not a perfect place to be a woman in India today in 2023, I assure you it's better than 1950. While I may not, as of the 29th of August 2023, have the right to get married as a queer person today, my life today is still better than it was in 1950. Things have improved dramatically. We forget the pain of the past. We should maybe remember it, only to remind ourselves how far we've come and how well we've done for ourselves. Maybe forgetting the pain of the past is a natural human reaction. I suppose that's why people have more than one children. Childbirth is so painful, I'm surprised that someone has a second. I'm third. I don't know what my mother was on. But you tend to forget unpleasantness of the past, because who wants to deal with that? But I think it's sometimes important for us to remember where we have come from to see how far we've reached. So my optimism is not just in the air. I've seen such radical examples of it. Indian society today, while may still be homophobic to some extent, accepts trans people far more than it is accepted in the West. There is an increasingly greater acceptance of queer people across the board. Certainly amongst young people, but even amongst older people. People of my parents' generation. I'd rather call myself old also, and I better go do it. My generation. Things are changing. Things are for the better. But remember, another US Supreme Court judgment in the context of abortion, and maybe we can wrap it up, is in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Justice Stevens, I think rightly for the majority, said that the price for liberty is constant vigilance. Right? So if you want to make sure that you are free, you always have to be aware and willing to fight for your rights, because it can always slip back. So be aware, citizens. Know that you have come, but you can go back, and be ready to fight. Don't expect other people to fight for you. Fight for yourself.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Saurabh. It's so much fun chatting with you, and you got me riled up about so many issues. It's so great to hear the perspectives from a lawyer as accomplished as you. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in to Love Matters today. If you'd like to write into us, you can do so at lovematters@dw.com. Love Matters is produced by Indian Express and DW, Germany's international broadcaster. We'd love it if you like and share, follow this podcast wherever you're listening to it. And till next time, this is me, Leeza Mangaldas, signing off. I believe love matters.